Alienation, Marxism, and Humanism. A Christian Viewpoint by Oskar Schatz and Ernst Florian Winter. Oskar Schatz, director of the scientific department of Radio Salzburg and of the Salzburger Night Studio since 1959, is a freelance political writer for newspapers in Austria and elsewhere. He was born in Salzburg in 1924, and upon graduation from the Salzburg Real Gymnasium in 1942 did military service, spending 2 years as a British prisoner of war. After the war, he studied natural science at the University of Vienna, then took up law and political science at the University of Innsbruck. He subsequently worked towards his doctorate in law with special interest in natural and political law at the Philosophical Institute in Salzburg. From 1961 to 1963, he participated in a Marxist seminar of the Eastern Institute in Salzburg under the direction of Professor E.F. Winter. He is presently preparing a thesis on alienation in the early writings of Marx. Ernst Florian Winter was born in Vienna in 1923, the eldest son of Dr. Ernst Karl Winter, a well-known Catholic sociologist. He emigrated to the United States after the Anschluss in 1938, receiving his BA, MA, and PhD degrees at Columbia University, and did Japanese studies at the University of Michigan. Since his return to Austria, he has taught history and political science, specializing in Central and Eastern Europe and the Far East. Co-founder and former co-editor of Cross Currents, he has contributed to various journals of opinion and is the author of, among other books, Austrian Neutrality, Origin, Content, and Outlook, and The Politics of Neutrality. This essay is the result of a seminar on humanism, socialism, and Christianity held from March 1962 to March 1963 at the Ostinstitut Internationales Forschungszentrum für... Oh, that's too much German, I'm not even going to bother. But now it's on to the essay. What legitimate interest could a Catholic Christian take today in socialism and humanism and their mutual relationship? Or to state it less ambitiously, what contribution to the present discussion might be expected from a Christian viewpoint concerning a humanist socialism? The concern for man's alienation seems to offer itself as a most useful connecting link between socialism and humanism and between Christians and non-Christians. For every serious analysis of the phenomenon man meets sooner or later the category of alienation, in itself a complete concept touching all kinds of human behavior. That man has become alienated in the process of his self-realization was part of the revolutionary message of Karl Marx. More than 100 years after Marx, alienation has lost none of its burning actuality. In fact, it has become a global phenomenon. After the conceptual and analytic beginnings in Rousseau, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, it was primarily and paradoxically the Marxist version of socialism and not the reflective thought of classical humanism or the practical witness of Christianity called love that continued to analyze concretely the modern dimensions of the problem of human alienation and also proposed a cure for it. Marx recognized the phenomenon of alienation, which developed into the decisive anthropological aspect of the industrial society, more clearly than any of his contemporaries. This he owed first of all to an intensive critique of Hegel's apparently abstract and idealistic theory of alienation. Secondly, however, From this analysis and critique, Marx arrived at his own conceptualization and suggested a utopia as the means of concretely solving the existential problem of human alienation. This nonetheless theoretical conclusion constitutes the personal greatness as well as the tragedy of Marx's position. Besides this, his solution has become of greatest significance for the subsequent evolution of the category alienation, because the latter is now increasingly suspected of being merely a subjective, arbitrary, and even ideological concept. This suspicion came to be focused mainly on the act of annulment, Aufhebung, that is, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the violence of class struggle, the communist society from which Marx expected the final solution of the problem of alienation. Marx sees the total character of the annulment as necessarily related to the totality characteristic of his alienation concept itself. Only thus can alienation be totally annulled and the total creative freedom of man realized. Yet the fact that the alienation of man has not only persisted, but also appeared in a new, and for Marxist socialism, unforeseen intensity, and has led to a deep longing for more humaneness, humanity, and socialist humanism, invites basic reconsiderations. Perhaps the solution Marx so passionately desired has not gone deep enough, has remained on the periphery of the phenomenon, despite or perhaps because of its radicalism. It appears to us that its radicalism was not radical enough in the original sense of the term. A radical theory of alienation must not stop at the social involvement of man, but must push right through to his innermost anthropological dimensions. The necessary corrective complement to Marx's, quote, real humanism does not, therefore, lie in an exaggerated positivist sociology, which is incapable of grasping man anthropologically and thus falls way behind Marxist sociology, but rather in a humanist philosophical anthropology which includes the problem of human alienation explicitly as an integral part of its vigorous theorizing about man. Moreover, once this new and deeper reflection about man's being and nature is established, it also becomes necessary to encourage the study of those concrete conditions set by modern man himself, which comprise his being and which tend to alienate him from his works and the outer world, from fellow man and from himself. This means clearly that today there can no longer exist a potent humanism without a serious appreciation of the category alienation. Even more important is Christianity's need for a clarification, inclusion, and mastery of the phenomenon of alienation, which, as Eric Thier has noticed, has already become part of the, quote, European vocabulary. We must finally add the common observation that the phenomenon of the alienated man is no longer restricted to the highly industrialized capitalist as well as socialist countries of the Western world, extending from San Francisco to Vladivostok, but really reaches as far as does the impact of the modern technical civilization on the non-Western world. During the second half of the 20th century, the alienated man is no longer a so-called European or Western or capitalist or socialist problem, but a global, universally human problem. Therefore, it must be analyzed as fully as possible and without ideological prejudices. All this by no means implies that the Marxian category of alienation has lost its validity, but it does mean that Marx's genuine insight is too peripheral and offers no final explanation. Rather, it is subject to the same changes and modifications as all social phenomenon today. Helmut Plessner characterized this recently when he said that alienation today concerns those very peculiarities of modern society. Quote, which it has been gaining through its striving against becoming proletarian and against class warfare, namely its high grade of organization and its rational compartmentalization for the purpose of a smoothly operating system. With the figure of speech alienated man, one characterizes the single individual in that social role which is being thrust upon him by an administered world. Man has become the bearer of functions. End quote. Helmut Plessner. Thus alienated man has become the, quote, outer-directed one. David Reisman. A category which, especially in its existential version, seems to share with the Marxist category alienation solely the name. True, Marx also applied alienation to the concrete individual human being, yet he precisely defines this individuality as species being. Although directly concerned with the individual, alienation was for Marx a process and phenomenon within man as species being, that is to say, within human society taken as totality. Persisting against this view is the existentialist alienation theory with which, by stressing not only the individuality, but also the uniqueness and singularity of each individual existence, every form of human socialization is in principle commensurable. While Marx recognized the cause of alienation more in the too low degree of human socialization, and therefore expected salvation from the, quote, socialized man of the future, the existential notion of alienation considers a totally socialized man equal to a total loss of man's nature. In view of the possibility of such a change into the opposite extreme, we say with Helmut Plessner that the appeal of existentialism to seek freedom and individuality internally has had the same impact on the process of man becoming an externally alienated mere thing, as does Marxist eschatology, which either places human self-realization at the end of prehistory or states categorically that there will be no alienation in the socialist system. In both cases, the concrete present-day suffering and hoping man seems in his completely unpretentious humanity woefully unrealistic and out of place. Ours is precisely this concern for the concrete man, embedded in mankind. It is for his sake that we must hold fast to the category alienation, but to a de-ideologized category, but to a de-ideologized category, which can further our search for a social political order a la tale de homme. Don't know what the hell that means. For this purpose, we propose now in part 2 to analyze the historic alienation concepts, and in part 3 to present a possible contemporary Christian viewpoint. Section 2. Wherever the search for an understanding of man and the striving for an illumination of the human condition predominates today, a thorough analysis of the notion of alienation as a key category forces itself upon us. This category is by no means simply a more or less esoteric notion, but presents itself rather as a, quote, real category indispensable for the description of social reality as well as contemporary conditions, end quote. I don't know who that's from. Maybe Marx. The category therefore neither denotes an imaginary space of pure interiority, nor relates to a world of massive exteriority, devoid of subjects, where it would become senseless. The interior and exterior cannot be severed from one another. If man, as was self-evident to the fathers of the alienation concept, is to be considered identical with the world and with the life of man, the latter again pointing to a central interiority. Hegel says in the famous preface to his Phenomenology of Spirit that the strength of the spirit is only as great as its unfolding. While the spirit unfolds itself into its exterior manifestation, this very process already offers the possibility and even the reality of alienation. Alienation, moreover, does not refer to a specific form of the subject or objective spirit to state, religion, or economics. Rather, the possibility of alienation is present wherever man, actively or passively, relates to the surrounding and objective world in order to find his identity with his self in his difference from this world. Modern cultural anthropologists explain how this imperative process of continuous self-identification is rooted in the very nature of man. Unlike the animal, with its fixation on a determined and biological environment with which it emerges and blends into a uniform nature, man must regain his original harmony and unity every moment of his existence without ever completely reaching it. Man does so by surrounding his kind with an artificial and man-made milieu, which becomes a kind of second nature to him, joining his original organically equipped nature. This principally unfixed relation to a concrete environment makes man what he really is, namely, an open, universal, historical, but also endangered being which can also lose itself in the course of its self-realization, i.e. become alienated, a process completely unthinkable in organic nature. An animal is always what it is. It cannot therefore alienate itself. Man, on the contrary, can alienate himself because he possesses consciousness and self-consciousness, confirming his being only through self-communication to his fellow men, and thus discovering his identity. This is a perception from the viewpoint of transcendental philosophy. However, in its absolute form, it became decisive for both German idealism and for the beginnings of the modern alienation theory. If we call this second nature of man his culture, one recognizes that the alienation of man is related essentially to civilization. And, since civilization is a social phenomenon, alienation also relates, in the last analysis, to the sociology of man. In the thoroughly unorganic and artificial world of culture and civilization, of community and social life, we describe alienation as an eminently social situation. Rousseau is the first to express its importance. Rousseau's critique of culture and society contains 2 points relevant for the category alienation. First, culture is a system excuse me. I feel like there's something in my throat. Rousseau's critique of culture and society contains 2 points relevant for the category of alienation. First, culture is a system of behavioral models claiming to be binding on human attitudes. Man, who has placed his life under the coercion of behavioral models and standards, is, however, no longer himself. He lives a life not decided by himself, but determined externally. Alienation, therefore, becomes synonymous with heteronomy. Even though the human life determining the cultural and social milieu is a man-made product. Alienation can thus be overcome solely by identifying the exterior laws exterior laws confronting man with the natural laws of reason. Reality must become rational. Rousseau's answer to the problem of alienation is not the myth of the eternal return, but the myth of revolution, anticipating an essential theme of Marxism. Since consciousness is always determined by social existence and not vice versa, this existence must be made reasonable. Only thus can this axiom of historical materialism signify the determination of reason through reason itself. Second, man living in the original state of nature is a being of integrity. Being and appearance coincide in his existence. Man is reconciled with himself. Social man, on the other hand, has lost his original harmony. He is always alienated. A break between that which one is and that which one appears to be exists. This rupture is a symptom of the misery and travail of our contemporary epoch. Rousseau's deep pessimism reveals a new life sentiment diametrically opposed to the progress optimism of the early 18th century. It is a very dark and unhappy consciousness that no longer binds confirmation in time, and is thus able to understand its own epoch only antithetically as one of decline, confusion, and absolute depravity. Herein lie the roots of a new understanding of history, which subsequently came to influence the classical German humanism of Lessing, Herder, and Schiller. This peculiar feeling for those times remains the obscure backdrop to that growing enthusiasm with which the best minds greeted the epochal events of the French Revolution. Like a photographic negative, this sure sense of corruption and of alienation accompanies the increasingly passionate demand for a final, quote, realization and, quote, reintegration of man. And these demands were primarily understood in terms of realizing human freedom. In Fichte's notion of the lost and regained freedom, one recognizes, though in abstract form, the core concept of the modern alienation theory, which, despite its thoroughly idealistic character, underlies the naturalistic theories of both Marx and Freud. Both are primarily concerned with freeing man from the determinism of those blind forces that man's productivity has produced and objectivized. I'm going to reread that sentence. Both Freud and Marx are primarily concerned with freeing man from the determinism of those blind forces that man's productivity has produced and objectivized. Whether these forces operate with the vigor and efficacy of laws of nature, in the present economic conditions, or in the drives of the unconscious becomes a subordinate question. What remains decisive is the idea that man can become lord over himself again, only when he makes the determining economic or psychological infrastructures rational. Any other form of freedom is illusory. The domination of being by consciousness is wrong. It must be overcome before the true relationship can emerge. The original affinity between Fichte's formula for lost freedom and Marx's and Freud's definitions of freedom as conscious necessity is not altered by the naturalistic and materialistic point of departure of the latter two, because in both cases the materialistic thesis can become true only in its negation. The customary labels, idealism and materialism, become irrelevant in view of the substantial idealism, which holds that the ideality manifest inside man can be externalized as direct subjectivity. Hegel, like Schelling, gave abstract developments greater concreteness. The spirit in Hegel produces his exteriority only from its interiority and against it. In order to annul the dialectical antithesis and rearrange the exteriority back into the new identity, a movement which he defined as, quote, identity of the identity and non-identity, end quote. This process transpires in a multitude of concrete negations and rearrangements, giving witness to a historic fabric of unheard-of richness. Here the transition from the, quote, subjective spirit to the, quote, objective spirit was achieved. Since Descartes, thinking had been turned more and more from an objective to a subjective world. Hume's denial of the causality principle and Kant's stressing of criticism had helped sever consciousness from the world. On the contrary, Hegel's system strove to liberate the, quote, subjective spirit from an empty formalism and liberate the subjective spirit back from mere self-certainty to the objective world. Hegel wanted to force man to part with himself, to, quote, alienate himself, in order to regain himself. Hegel's phenomenology contains this central idea of a dialectical process in which alienation constitutes the negative movement. It is the negative of the position, yet not an absolute negative. For in the negative of the negative, it is annulled and preserved in a higher synthesis. Alienation becomes thus the motor, the living pulse of this powerful epoch of the spirit. Although Marx relies directly on the phenomenology in his Parisian manuscripts, his starting point is a completely different one, characterized by the destruction of the absolute spirit and the concomitant change of speculative philosophy into philosophical anthropology. The primary tendency of this new direction, culminating in Feuerbach's criticism of religion, is the critical return to man as such. The proper goal becomes the establishment of a, quote, real humanism. In his Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, 1844, Marx critically discusses the speculative alienation concept of Hegel from the point of real humanism. He criticizes mainly that, quote, spirituality, which reduces concrete man to an abstract self-consciousness. What about that realm which has become alienated to man, the state, wealth, etc.? Quote, it is precisely abstract thought from which these objects are alienated and which they confront with their presumptuous reality. The philosopher, himself an abstract form of alienated man, sets himself up as the measure of the alienated world. End quote. Marx. In order to identify, quote, alienation, non-alienated and true reality, against which alone the fall and loss can be measured, must be presupposed. This measure is not the ego and, quote, self, this abstract man, but rather the, quote, real corporeal man, with his feet firmly planted on the solid ground, inhaling and exhaling all the powers of nature, end quote. Good Marx getting all poetic. Self-consciousness is solely a quality of man's nature, and not the reverse, as speculative thinking cares to maintain. This error calls forth weighty consequences for the concept of alienation. Quote, "It is not the fact that the human being objectifies himself inhumanely in opposition to himself, but that he objectifies himself by distinction from and in opposition to abstract thought, which constitutes alienation as it exists and as it has to be transcended." End quote. Marx's critical energy is thus directed primarily against the relationship between objectivity and alienation, as he thought Hegel saw it. Quote, "Objectivity as such is regarded as an alienated human relationship, which does not correspond with the essence of man, self-consciousness. The reappropriation of the objective essence of man, which was produced as something alien and determined by alienation, signifies the supersession not only of alienation, but also of objectivity. That is, man is regarded as a non-objective spiritual being." End quote. I think that's Marx. This fundamental confusion between alienation and objectivity has wide-ranging consequences for the appropriation of an alienated human being. Quote, "We have already seen that the appropriation of alienated objective being, or the supersession of objectivity in the condition of alienation, which has to develop from indifferent otherness to real antagonistic alienation, signifies for Hegel also, or primarily, the supersession of objectivity, since it is not the determinate character of the object, but the object's objective character, which is the scandal of alienation for self-consciousness. The object is therefore negative, self-annulling a nullity." End quote. Marx. Marx reproaches Hegel for not taking real alienation seriously enough, for being guilty of a, quote, "uncritical idealism," which can easily turn into a quote, "uncritical positivism," ready to vindicate the real alienated life at the very moment when it believes it has been subdued intellectually. For when self-conscious man recognizes the general existence of his world as self-alienation, when he annuls it and, quote, "claims to be at home in his other being," end quote, he affirms this real life in its alienated shape, passing it off as its true being. Quote, "Thus reason is at home in unreason as such. Man, who has recognized that he leads an alienated life in law, politics, etc., leads his true human life in this alienated life as such. But in actuality, private right, morality, the family, civil society, the state, etc., remain, only they have become moments, modes of existence of man, which have no validity in isolation, but which mutually dissolve and engender one another. They are moments of movement." End quote. Marx. Marx is not simply in favor of the mere annulment of alienated institutional forms, but for the liquidation of the alienated being, the alienated objectivity. The insignificant difference in nuance between, quote, "annulling" and, quote, "liquidating" clearly shows the difference between a contemplative-oriented appreciation of the world and the practical revolutionary ideology of Marx. When Marx speaks of alienation, he means not only a negation in the sense of a logical opposition, but the fall into a sphere of wickedness, ruin, and profligacy. An undercurrent foreign to idealism exists in all of this, and also the upside-down variety of Feuerbach, already apparent in the cultural criticism of German classics. Fichte speaks of his age as the age of consummated sinfulness. But while Lessing, Herder, and Schiller were quite skeptical as to the final abolition of contemporary alienation and escaped into schematic historic constructs, Marx was quite confident of the imminent breakthrough into a new eon. A breakthrough, moreover, which would be solely the deed of mankind. This new age would be determined not by the law of alienation and confusion, but exclusively by the factors of totality, entirety, and universal harmony. Marx obviously attached the conceptual logic and complete unequivocally defined Hegelian concept of alienation to a precise historic period, which in the full sense of the word has not even become history as yet. Marx called it prehistory in the formation of man. But also for him, this human prehistory was stamped by the rhythm of the inner laws of alienation, by the negation of the negation. Quote, in conceiving the negation of the negation, from the aspect of the positive relation inherent in it, as the only true positive, and from the aspect of the negative relation inherent in it, as the only true act and self-confirming act of all being, Hegel has merely discovered an abstract, logical, and speculative expression of the historical process, which is not yet the real history of man as a given subject, but only the history of the act of creation, of the genesis of man. End quote. Marx. It was perhaps Marx's most ingenious accomplishment to define this thoroughly negative act through which man, during the hitherto existing course of history, could confirm himself as man, namely as labor, toil, work. Yet even in this achievement, he was able to relate directly to Hegel's phenomenology. Quote, the outstanding achievement of Hegel's phenomenology, the dialectic of negativity as the moving and creative principle, is, first, that Hegel grasps the self-creation of man as a process, objectification as loss of the object, as alienation and transcendence of this alienation, and that he therefore grasps the nature of labor and conceives objective man, true because real man, as the result of his own labor. End quote. Marx. In the last analysis, it is work, and particularly the modern form of wage labor, which has become the basis for the total alienation of modern man. The intrinsic nature of work itself constitutes and determines that. The product of work confronts man as a strange being and as an independent power. In other words, the realization of work appears as the irreality of the wage laborer, as loss of, as well as servitude under, the object. If, therefore, man is to be set free against his own objective products, and if alienation is really to be overcome, the proper cause and source of every type of human alienation, namely work, must be eliminated and raised into a new positive form of human self-activity, in which there will be no more room for any kind of negativity. Alienated work can be overcome because it is only a relativity, an historically limited condition for human existence. Alienated work must not be considered an essential part of human nature. As different as Hegel and Marx might be in their last spiritual intentions, their thinking stood challenged by the same contradictory, antagonistic reality of an early capitalist society. According to their innermost intentions, however, they answered this challenge differently. Hegel with the philosophical gnosis of absolute knowledge and with rational mysticism, Marx with the utopia of a healed and integrated world in which the original myth of a happy paradisical life continues to resound. Section 3. Has the crisis of alienation really found for us its focus in work? Obviously, during the past 200 years, Western philosophically oriented, and later also socially oriented thinking has been increasingly reflective and differentiated in its search for an understanding of the phenomenon of alienation. Marx saw also the moment near at hand to do something concrete about its solution. Yet it appears that theory and practice, while becoming more integrated, are also becoming more ambivalent. Two extreme fronts can be observed. The one, older and traditional, which is usually identified with the religious sentiment and philosophical speculations, prefers to solve the problem by seeing alienation as primarily, if not exclusively, related to interiority, even to sin and original sin. Man must be converted to a toilsome interior purification. All energies are concentrated on this process with patience, humility, and perseverance. The world and mankind, and the products of human creativity, are of only indirect concern. Theologically speaking, the concepts and the efficacy of soul and grace are needed for the reintegration of man, for love, for peace, and the regaining of true freedom. The liberation of man must never be the work of malediction and violence. Rather, mankind's fate is a long-drawn process of individual transformation and collective illumination. Actually, everyone knows that this has been the religious and philosophical wisdom of East and West throughout the ages, and Christianity in particular has attempted to institutionalize the reform of interiority and the practice of love. The philosophers in the Western tradition, from Socrates to Kant, have also made progress, even though often slow and painful, in the direction of giving social life ethical foundations. Christianity, humanism, and socialism have participated in this ethical momentum. However, it appears that an overwhelming concentration on the interiority of the problem will not be sufficient to solve the problem. The other, more recent and revolutionary approach is an extreme call for exteriority, for the liquidation of alienation. The objectivity must be liquidated in order to transform and liberate man. The development of concrete forms of human alienation forces the alternative upon man. The sole concentration on making man better by spiritual means comes too late in view of the surging masses of mankind and the awesome products of their alienation. From the original interior alienations of man from God, from himself, and from his fellow men, emphasis has shifted the exterior social and economic forms of alienation. While the former appears elusive, the latter submit to practical manipulation. Thus Marx, who ran through the gamut of alienations, finally concentrated his attention on the realm of economics. However, it is clear that even Marx's view cannot be equated with a simple, quote, materialization of the concept of alienation, as if man were solely motivated by greed for material things. On the contrary, Marx wanted to liberate man from the fetters of blind economic determinisms. Thus, Marx's shift from an abstract philosophical personal occurrence, as alienation was conceived traditionally, Thus Marx's shift from an abstract philosophical personal occurrence, as alienation was conceived traditionally, to the personal peripheral realm of material production certainly contributed to our more differentiated understanding and increased our apperception of the anthropological dimension and key role of work. Yet in the prophetic stipulation, the alienation must be liquidated exclusively through atheism, class struggle, dictatorship, and revolutionary measures in political economy, lies the undifferentiated, one-sided tragedy of the Marxist utopia. How can these two extreme views be reconciled in view of the manifest urgency of resolving alienation on this earth without violence? A brief reference to two present phenomena will help us to see the possible direction of common Christian, humanist, and socialist action. Alienated work and labor is a more gigantic factor today in both so-called capitalist as well as socialist countries than could ever have been foreseen during the time of Marx. Nowhere has the so-called achievement of socialism fulfilled its promise, i.e. the liquidation of alienation and the realization of man's freedom. Everywhere, the increase in the number of wage laborers and the qualitative changes through scientific revolutions and enormous growth of productivity have increased alienation. The changes everywhere, from an agrarian to a beginning industrial and subsequently advanced industrial and early atomic structure, have been accompanied by a progressive alienation in all types of political economy. The trend has clearly been towards an anthropological alienation of widest dimensions. Plainly, alienated modern man can attribute his alienated condition to the economic and social life released through industrial production, automation, consumption, and atomic society, rather than to the polarization of rich and poor, still decisive for Hegel and Marx. Thus, the creativity of man has suffered not only a spiritual alienation at the very height of its colossal achievements, not only an economic one at the time of plenty and productivity, but more recently, in addition, an anthropological existential one. What is the ultimate sense of man, his life, his work? Before the contemporary leap into the realm of free time, work had increasingly become the realm of necessity. With leisure, a new chance for realizing man's eternal longing, the possibility of a non-alienated creative being has appeared. However, for far too many, the result has been the alienation of leisure time. Man can be freed from labor, and thus alienation, more than ever before. Yet, in a consumer, entertainment, and welfare society, alienated leisure time, analogous to alienated labor, becomes the anthropological problem. For what then does man have leisure? The practical humanism of Christianity can meet the humanism of responsible neo-socialism through a common concern for the humanization of man, work, and the world. There can be no final solution to history in this world. Rather, a Christian concentrates with eschatological hope on the immediate phase of human history at hand. This unfolds itself plainly in a labor of love and the overcoming of concrete appearances of alienation today, instead of adding further manifestations of alienation. Projection remains one of the direct consequences of alienation. To hypostatize an exterior enemy that must be destroyed, whether the capitalist, the Jew, the socialist, the religious man, the Negro, the communist, etc., is not ending alienation, but accelerating alienation's fatality. In its place, and in place of utopia at an inhuman price, and idealistic prognostication, spiritually justified, many social, economic, and anthropological dimensions of alienation could be concretely reduced. This is obvious in respect to the color line, poverty, servitude, occupational emptiness, work motivation, occupational therapy, racial prejudice, war, leisure time programming, institutionalized freedoms, inalienable human rights, co-determination in decision-making processes, teamwork, and the like, to mention only a few possibilities. A Catholic Christian can take a genuine interest in humanism and socialism today, precisely because together they could attempt to answer the question posed so far. Marx started with religious alienation and proceeded via political and social alienation to economic alienation, which he felt to be the root of all human alienation. Modern Christian thinking starts with the typical concrete alienation phenomenon of an advanced industrial and beginning atomic society, recognizing in them a most acute expression of the deep frustration of man's creativity and his longing for purpose and community life, and proceeds finally to a self-critical awareness of the problems posed by religious alienation as the basic form of human alienation per se. Contrary to Marx's criticism and many Christians' defense, we do not limit this religious alienation to theoretical interior consciousness, but rather extend it to a phenomenon for which Christians are responsible. No institutionalized religion poses in itself a guarantee against man's alienation from God, from himself, from his fellow men, from his work and its products, and from the world. In other words, it would be unrealistic simply to point uncritically to religion as the solution of the problem. It appears to us a special duty to proclaim this, because without this recognition, there can be no understanding of the insoluble interdependence between alienation in so-called profane and secular realms and the spiritual crisis within the great religions, including Christianity. Christianity, since the birth of Christ, has been no bystander, but a responsible actor in history. As Christians, we must call for reform inside Christianity and the Church, wherever they appear co-responsible for the alienation of man. The connection between alienation, idolatry, and fanaticism has become more than obvious today. These aberrations are quite possible within Christian ranks, though genuine Christian thinking will always, together with mea culpa, have to warn against the opposite extreme of deifying human spontaneity and liberty. In short, wherever one is seriously concerned about the humanity of man, God's care concerning man cannot be excluded and dismissed as irrelevant. It is this care concerning man which, in a modern pluralistic world, unites the Christian with all those, whatever their Weltanschauung, who are moved to humanize man and the human condition. That the Christian's involvement is for the sake of God's incarnation is their affair. The common concern and not the dividing lines is what matters. Only one question remains. How can Christians recognize their proper tasks? In the great universal community of life and love we call the Church, there are above all the lay people, dedicated to life and witness in the world, who know themselves to be united to all those working on the step-by-step overcoming of exterior alienation. The priests of God are dedicating themselves increasingly to help resolve interior alienation. With John the 23rd, this interchurchly division of labor has been entering a new stage of experimentation, opening new vistas for a new age of world imminent hope. To close the gap between the two extreme positions discussed earlier, the people of the Church can be of great help. For on the way of the great reconciliation, we find that indeed institutions must be altered and souls must be healed, two tasks that must not be exercised one at the expense of the other, or be structurally confused, but rather undertaken simultaneously. We therefore plead that the beginnings of a reconciliation of traditional polarity be recognized as the most workable basis for reconciling the basic antithesis between matter and spirit. Let us start forthwith to resolve the central modern problem of work.